Well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're at. Hello, everybody out there, webinar attendees. This is Zach Pacello coming to you from Indiana, is where I reside at. I've been a consultant for the past 9 years with the KPA recently, and a team leader for the last year as well, too. A little bit about me. I've been, and as Allison mentioned, I'm a board-certified safety professional. Been in the field doing that for the past 4 years. Certified Hazardous Materials Manager as well too through the International Hazardous Materials Manager Association, OSHA outreach trainer, been through all these classes. And so what all is the key element in doing all that? It is training. And so hopefully you're here today because you're caught in this tangled world wide web of training when it comes to, hey, we've got to train our people. More than likely you already know that you need to train your people, which is why you're here. So with environmental health and safety, it can get even more sticky as far as what do I actually need to train my people about when it comes to OSHA compliance, when it comes to EPA compliance. What is this DOT, Department of Transportation? Does that affect us? Do we need to have our people trained in that? So today what I'd like to do is, and I've got a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to try to go a little bit quickly here through a lot of different slides. But first thing I'm going to talk about would be the big three when it comes to safety training. Then I'm going to go into some more safety training when it comes to possibly specific site features, such as like maybe we're getting into talking about if you have a forklift on site or if you have respirators that are being used by your employees. From there, we'll jump over to environmental or EPA training, and then we'll talk about Department of Transportation training as well too. At the end, I've got some tips, and finally, we'll open up for some questions at the end as well. So like I said, lots of different material to cover here, and you're here because you want to know what specifically should I be training my people in. The way I've set this webinar up is I'll hit a specific subject, I'll review what the subject is, then on the next slide I'll go over who needs to be trained in that, and then how often should that training be refreshed as well too. And that's kind of how I have this whole setup. So some of these slides might apply to you in your site, some of them might not. However, please stick around for all of this so that you can make sure you get the important information out of it that you need to. One disclaimer here before we begin is that this presentation is an overview of the training courses. Once again, it's not intended to be an all-inclusive list. You might have even further needs depending on maybe some site-specific features. Maybe you have some site-specific machinery on site that really needs some specialized training in that. So this presentation is to promote your awareness when it comes to what your training needs might be. And also more courses might be required based off of local and state requirements as well too. Such as if you live in California, you're going to have a few more requirements than maybe somebody that lives in one of the Midwest states. If you do need to or would like to have an in-depth conversation with the KPA consultant about what kind of specific training needs might be required in your local area, feel free to contact KPA, and we'll put you in touch with the consultant and go over some of those site and state-specific requirements. So the big three. The first one on the big threes list is going to be the subject of emergency response. Who is this applicable to? This is applicable to pretty much every facility that is out there. If you have employees on site, you need to have an emergency response plan put together. And what is it going to cover? It's going to cover how to prevent a fire from occurring. In case there is a fire, how do you go about fighting that fire? In case there is an evacuation that is necessary, what is the evacuation plan for the facility? What's your accountability plan as well too? For instance, we have a rally point, but once everybody hits that rally point, how are we accounting for everybody? Is there a certain emergency coordinator that needs to be set up? Also, natural disasters need to be covered in that emergency response plan. So if you think about it, who does this pertain to? It's going to pertain pretty much to everybody. Also in this emergency response plan, we're talking about fire extinguisher training, and I wanted to jump in this and break it out just a little bit more. Like, I get a lot of questions about fire extinguisher training. Do we need to do hands-on training when it comes to fire extinguishers? Well, if you look at 29 CFR 1910.157G1, which I know all of you are going to rush to your code books and look that up immediately, basically it goes over the general principles on fire extinguisher training, and then it talks about hands-on training, whether or not it is required. So really, to break it down for you though, hands-on training is really required for employees who are specifically assigned to fight fires. If you designate that if we have a fire, John Doe and Joe Smith, you are responsible for grabbing the fire extinguishers, responding to the fire, and putting that out. They must be specifically assigned to, or must specifically have hands-on training on how to activate that extinguisher and use it. Also, if you put together a fire brigade, maybe you have certain responders that are going to respond to a fire. They must have hands-on training when it comes to using a fire extinguisher. And don't get me wrong, hands-on training is a good training for everybody. However, that can also get costly when it comes to training everybody in the entire facility. Way to go around on this one is that you have fire extinguishers. An employee can use that fire extinguisher if they choose to do so. However, the main response for all of your employees is really to evacuate in response to a fire. And then you're not designating anybody as being required to use a fire extinguisher, and therefore there's no requirement for hands-on training at that point. So who is emergency response required for? Well, it's required for pretty much all employees, and you probably got that from the first slide that we did go through and talk about. All employees might have to respond to a fire. All employees definitely need to respond in an evacuation. So we can't leave anybody out when it comes to that training. That's why it's required for pretty much all employees upon initial assignment. And so when do you need to do this training? Like I said, upon initial assignment, or whenever they become operational, whenever there's any change to the plan that you have put together, your emergency response written plan, which you do need to have that plan in writing. If you ever make a change to that, then you need to redo training for everybody. Maybe you moved the rally point for the evacuation. Maybe you installed a new fire alarm. At that point, everybody does need to be retrained. And then the fire extinguisher portion, it is required to be annually trained. So really, when it boils down to it, you do need to probably do emergency response training as a refresher course on an annual basis. The next of the big three would be hazard communication. And like I said, there it is the #1 cited OSHA violation, has been for years. It's applicable if employees handle chemicals on site. If they're going to be exposed to hazardous chemicals at any time, then they need to go through hazard communication training. What does the training cover? Well, you're going to be talking about the different types of hazards that are going to be found on site, where the employees are going to be around those chemicals or using those chemicals. It's going to go over your safety data sheets. How do you maintain the safety data sheets? Where can the employees find the safety data sheets? And how do they go about reading one? The chemical inventory. You must list out a chemical inventory and show the employees where to find that inventory in case they want to have access to it. How to label a container the right way. And then what are the different hazard classifications as well too. And on a side note, don't forget that back in 2013, the globally harmonized system standards came into play, meaning that all employees need to be trained by the end of 2013. And so this GHS standard went into full compliance just a couple months ago, June of 2016. So there's no more dates to push back on to say, well, we're not in full compliance until what yada yada date. No, that time has come and passed. You must be in full compliance with the globally harmonized system at this time. So who needs to be trained in hazard communication? Once again, all chemical handling employees. When do they need to be trained? Upon initial assignment to work with hazardous chemicals. So if you're going to move somebody from the office back to maybe into the warehouse and they're going to be handling hazardous chemicals, now they're on initial assignment. They need to go through hazard communication training before they take up on that assignment. And whenever a new health or physical hazard is introduced into the workplace as well too. So if you are running a production line and we need to add in a new chemical for this new production line, now there's a new possible health hazard going on there. Maybe it's a new corrosive chemical where we did not have corrosive chemicals in the past. Now there's a new health hazard there. We need to, or new physical hazard, burn hazard. Now we need to retrain everybody over hazard communication so they can understand what a corrosive chemical is and how it could possibly hurt them in this process. How are they going to be exposed to that corrosive chemical? Another good way to make sure you know that your employees are fully trained on this is do a test for understanding as well too. Not a bad idea to do a mock compliance interview. I do these a lot of the times when I'm out doing my consultant work. I will do hazard communication training at an on-site visit at one of my clients, and then maybe 3 months later I go back and I pick a random person that was on that roster and I go up to them and I say, hey, can you show me how to find a safety data sheet for this product right here? I pull it off the workbench. And usually one of two things happens. They look at me like, who are you and what are you talking about? And okay, what is this? I have no idea what you're talking about, safety data sheet. Or hopefully they paid well attention to the training and they run and go get the safety data sheet and bring it back to me. If you get the first response, it's time to redo training because obviously they didn't take it in the first time. And maybe we need to reevaluate the way that we have our safety data sheets available for employees as well too. So it's a good little test for understanding, just a mock kind of interview from a compliance officer about where can I find a safety data sheet for this particular chemical? And if they have trouble, it's probably time to do training for everybody. So I recommend that you at least do the hazard communication on an annual basis. When it comes to actual compliance, basically the regulation states that at least upon initial assignment and whenever there's any change, health or physical hazard change introduced to the workplace. But once again, recommendation is annually. And the last of the big three is personal protective equipment. Once again, this is applicable if an employee is going to wear personal protective equipment to do their job safely. Who does this, or what does this training cover? Well, you must cover in the training topic when the personal protective equipment must be worn, what is necessary to be wearing it, how to take it on, how to take it off, how to adjust it, how to wear it properly, take care of it, store it, what's the shelf life of that personal protective equipment, and what's the disposal possibilities of it as well too. I walked into a shop not long ago, and there was one where they used respirators in a spraying process. And I walked back to the paint area, and I see a guy wearing a respirator mask. And I recognize this respirator mask. It's a pretty popular one that's out there. And let's just say that the respirator was completely dark gray all the way around, even where the filters are at. And from my knowledge, these respirators should not be that color. And so I asked him, how long have you been wearing that respirator for? Oh, and he responds to me, oh, I've been wearing it for about, the past 6 months. Well, if he went through a proper personal protective equipment training, he's going to understand that that respirator needed to have been changed out on a continual basis, and really it was probably only good for about 2 weeks at the most. So a personal protective equipment class needs to be going over things like that as far as when to change out this equipment, or else you will have employees out there that try to prolong the life of it and use it way longer than it should be used. And then you got the employees on the other hand that never wear it at all. You walk out into a facility and nobody's wearing safety glasses at all, as we got sparks flying all over the place and we got things flying through the air, and nobody got on a pair of safety glasses except for you. There's something wrong with that picture, and now it's time to do training. So who needs to be trained in personal protective equipment? All employees required to wear the equipment must be trained in it. When must they be trained? Well, before they use the personal protective equipment. Any changes which makes previous training obsolete. For instance, maybe a new process has been introduced. Maybe there's a new welder on site. We've never had a welding equipment before, but now we do. Well, we need to do personal protective equipment training again because light burns are an issue when it comes to welding. And if these guys aren't wearing the right type of welding mask, then we're going to have a problem with possibly them getting light burns. If there's any changes in the type of personal protective equipment provided and any inadequacies in an employee's knowledge, that one is based off of a supervisor taking a look at the employee as they're working, and they see that the employee is wearing the wrong kind of mask. The employee is not wearing any safety glasses at all. No hard hat when they should be wearing a hard hat. That's an inadequacy in the employee's knowledge. Time to retrain them and show them the right way of what your company's policy is for wearing personal protective equipment. So those are the big three. We've got emergency response required for everybody, hazard communication required for all your chemical handlers, personal protective equipment required for everybody wearing personal protective equipment. My recommendation as a consultant, train all your people in those three subjects, because chances are, unless you're in complete office situation, you're probably being exposed to the equipment or to chemicals or to emergency situations every day. So now let's get into some site-specific courses. So once again, this if applicable statement is going to come up on each one of these. And you'll see probably right here up the top of the page here, blood-borne pathogens. I get questioned about this a lot in my experience. Do we need to do blood-borne pathogens training? Do we need a program Do we need one of those bodily fluid cleanup kits? Well, to answer some of those questions, bloodborne pathogens training and compliance with the standard is applicable if there is a reasonable expectation of employee exposure to blood on a day-to-day basis, or if you are an emergency responder to a first aid cleanup site and you are a designated emergency responder, then bloodborne pathogens would be a requirement for you. So let's examine that a little bit further. Reasonable expectation of employee exposure to blood. If you work in a facility such as a dealership, car dealership, where you have a service department, there's not really a reasonable expectation that there's going to be blood around on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, you're going to have your cuts here and there on employees that have accidents, but there's not going to be just pools of blood sitting around or bodily fluids sitting around every day. I hope not, at least. If there are, then we've got some other issues to talk about. But this is for if you work in a clinic, a laboratory, if you work in a hospital, any type of medical field. Yeah, there's reasonable expectation of blood exposure there. They need bloodborne pathogens programs. Once again, emergency responders. So if you at your facility designate that, hey, John Doe, you're going to be an emergency responder in case we ever have an employee injury on site, before the paramedics arrive, you're going to grab the first aid supplies and run to be on scene. Well, that person should be trained in bloodborne pathogens training because they would have that reasonable expectation to be exposed to blood. What does it cover? It covers the pathogens, diseases that somebody could be exposed to, methods used for controlling the occupational exposure. It also covers a hepatitis B vaccine, which if you have a bloodborne pathogens program, you must offer the hepatitis B vaccine to employees at no cost to the employee. So keep that in mind as well. Medical evaluations in case there is an exposure, and also post-exposure follow-ups and procedures. That all gets included in the bloodborne pathogen program and training. Once again, who should be completing that training? Employees who have expectation to be working around blood. And if they don't have that expectation, there's no reason to train them or have a program on site. When must this training be done? Upon initial assignment, and it is a requirement for an annual refresher as well too. Next subject kind of links right into here will be first aid and CPR. A lot of people ask me, kind of linked right into that bloodborne pathogens, do I need to have somebody here CPR trained or somebody be a first aid basic life support trained person on site? Well, it's applicable if the establishment is not in near proximity of an infirmary, hospital, or clinic. So basically, in way that OSHA they don't have a certain time frame or certain mileage of how close you are supposed to be to an infirmary or hospital or clinic. If you can have EMS services on site within about 3 to 4 minutes, probably 5 to 6 would be exceptional as well too. You call 911, takes them about maybe 4 or 5 minutes to get there, then they are your first aid CPR responders. It is not required to have somebody first aid trained or CPR certified on site then. However, if you live maybe, or if your facility is more out in kind of a more rural type area, I was wondering if I was going to get that word out right, rural type area, then you might not have a close infirmary, clinic, hospital. It might take EMS services about 10 or 15 minutes to get on site. And if that is the case, then yes, you do need to have somebody trained specifically in first aid and also a CPR provider as well too. So what does it cover? The EMS must be trained in at least how to prepare to responding to victims, assessing the victims. They must be trained in life-threatening injuries and also non-life-threatening injuries. And once again, when it comes to maybe you're on the border of, well, I don't know, we're in a pretty urban area, but it might take the EMS services about 20 minutes to get here. Well, always err on the side of caution. And I'm not trying to throw these things out there saying, no, you should not have somebody trained in first aid because EMS would be your first aid responder. No, no. If you want to have a first aid responder, CPR certified person on site, go for it. Err on the side of caution. The safer, the better. Just if you don't want to and you're looking for a way around this one, I'm not trying to throw loopholes out there, but you know, you can rely on EMS service as your first aid trained responder. So who should be trained in this? Well, you must designate people to be first responders, and they are the ones that receive the first aid and CPR training. It's always good to put up a list of who those identified people are as well. When must they be trained? Upon initial assignment, and their periodic refreshers will be for bloodborne pathogens annually, CPR every 2 years. If you have an AED on site, you need to go off your manufacturer's recommendations. A lot of facilities are putting these automated external defibrillators on site, basically a little paddle setup that does the pulses to try to revive somebody. On these machines, they do require training, even though they're pretty much set up to be foolproof, where they won't work until you have them set up right. Still, employees need to be trained on how to use those, and based on whoever provided you with the equipment or the manufacturer equipment should have manufacturer's recommendations on how often training should be completed, and that's what you should go by for those. Now we're going into energy control program, or as I like to call it, lockout tagout. So this is a bit more site specific. However, many facilities do have to have an energy control program. So applicable if equipment will be de-energizing, or employees will be working around de-energized equipment in which the unexpected startup or release of energy could cause injury. So somebody is working on a piece of machinery and they power it down at the breaker, which is on the other side of the plant. Then they go over and they got their hands on the machine. Somebody wants to start up the machine, they go see that the breaker has been flipped, they turn on the machine, and now we have an accident where somebody was caught inside the machinery. The whole purpose of this is to prevent that from happening in the workplace, locking out, tagging out equipment, controlling that energy. One thing I will say is that in my past experience, you might be thinking, do I have to, we really don't have anything to do with lockout, tagout. We've never had to do anything like that in the past. Our consultants haven't said anything about it, and why haven't we done anything with lockout, tagout? Well, typically my best response is to leave it up to the electrical contractors. Really, the entity that is going to be doing the locking out and the tagging out of the equipment should be installing their own energy control program, and you should work together on that as well too. Those are the employees that need to be trained on locking out and tagging out. If you have your own maintenance team on site, if you have employees of your own facility actually doing the locking out, the tagging out, and the repairing of the equipment, then yes, they need to be trained. However, if you have contractors on site, still employees should be aware of lockout, tagout program, but they are the actual authorized people to be locking out and tagging out the equipment. What do I mean by authorized? Well, the program covers two areas. You have authorized employees and affected employees. The authorized ones are going to be the ones doing the de-energizing of the equipment. So they're going to power it down. They're going to put the locks on there. They're going to put the tags on there. They need to be trained in tags, what tags to use, what to write on the tags. They're in control of the keys at all times. Then you have affected employees. The affected employees are not doing any of the locking out and tagging out, but they are affected because they might see a lock on a piece of equipment or a tag on a piece of equipment. And if they see that out there, that means that, hey, don't touch it. And don't try to go get some bolt cutters and cut off the lock or anything like that. I can't imagine people doing that, but you never know with some people. Those are the affected employees, and they should just basically make them aware that, hey, we've got lockout tagout going on. This is what it means. Do not try to power up this piece of equipment because people are working on it. And here's the people that are working on it. So some generalized training when it comes to that. Those are affected people or employees. Who needs to be trained? If you have an energy control program, then authorized and affected employees need to be trained in that. When do they need to be trained? Well, they need to be trained upon initial assignment. If there's a change in assignment, machine, or process, then retraining needs to be done. And then doing periodic inspections reveals any deficiencies, training needs to be done once again. So if, once again, you're out there and you see an employee working on a piece of equipment and you go over to the breaker and you see there's no lock, no tag on there, we've got a deficiency in our training program. We need to go back out there and retrain on our energy control program, showing these people how to lock out, tag out things the correct way. Next site-specific training would be powered industrial truck training. So this could be applied to you if you have a powered industrial truck. Notice I'm using the words powered industrial truck. I am not saying forklift. Why? Because powered industrial truck covers other things besides forklifts. As you can see in the pictures here, and I just wanted to throw this out there and make sure everybody understands, you got a forklift up top there. Yep, that is going to require forklift training, of course. Down below, you've got a motorized pallet jack. So the way to classify this, if the employee can drive the piece of machinery, and it's a heavy-duty machinery doing basically lifting, then that is a powered industrial truck. Now, if that pallet jack in the bottom picture there was not motorized and the employee put their own push and pull into that, then that is not considered a powered industrial truck. And it's the driving portion of it. It might be battery powered to lift up the drums, which is fine, but once it goes into the employee not having to use their own force to push pull the pallet jack, it's motorized and they drive it, that's when training comes into place. So it's applicable if the employee will use a powered industrial truck. Covers the following. You've got two portions to this training, classroom and then the operator's exam as well too. Classroom training is going to go over what type of equipment they're going to be driving, the operating controls, the work environment that they're going to be around using that piece of equipment, and then equipment inspections and what to do in case you find something wrong with the truck. Then you go into, once they pass the classroom portion of it, what's the operator's exam? And that is where you're going to observe the employee as they drive the piece of equipment, giving them some practice, and then you're going to have them make some maneuvers, and then you're going to sign off whether it's acceptable for them to drive the piece of equipment, or maybe, no, I don't feel comfortable with that guy behind the wheel. He's going to have to do a lot more practice work with this before we release him out in the warehouse. Because if you got somebody in the practice exam that bumps into a post, if they maybe puncture a drum or something like that, no, you shouldn't be signing off that they are a forklift operator. And one of the things, or a powered industrial truck operator, and one of the things that will quickly fail somebody is if they get on that thing and they don't put a seatbelt on, if it is a forklift, if they do not put their seatbelt on, that is an automatic fail right there, and they need to go back to the classroom portion of it as well too. Don't even give them the chance of saying, hey, you didn't put your seatbelt on. No, just fail them right there, because that's going to get the message through to them that they must wear the seatbelt at all times. I don't know how many times I've watched some guy go across a parking lot on a forklift with no seatbelt on, and it just drives me up the wall. I got to stop him. I got to go over, seatbelt laws with them. You put it on when you're in your car. What's the difference here? Well, you got to wear your seatbelt. Who needs to be trained? Employees who will operate the equipment. When do they need to be trained? Well, upon initial assignment of the operating equipment. This one's a little bit different. This one, it stretches it out a little bit farther when it comes to refreshers. So it's every 3 years, forklift training will expire and they need to be refreshed, or as needed based upon observation. Personal fall arrest systems. This is basically here what we're talking about is for harness lanyards. So it's applicable if the employees are expected to work near unguarded leading edges above 4 feet. Now this is 4 feet. This is general industry is what I am talking about. If you are in construction, that is different. That is 6 feet when it comes to those regulations. However, we're sticking with general industry for this presentation. So if an employee is going to be working above 4 feet, no guardrail around, they actually need to have some kind of fall protection around them or a harness lanyard on. And that's where we get the personal fall arrest system. What does the training cover? Well, the equipment limits, tie-off techniques, estimated free fall distances, deceleration distances, total distance, because some people will actually go out there, they will tie off on a point and not realize that your harness, or I'm sorry, your life lanyard has a shock absorber in there, meaning that if you fall, it's going to go for about 2 feet, then the shock absorber kicks in and it gives you an extra 3 feet. Well, at that point, if you're tying off at 4 feet and you've already got 2 feet plus 3 feet of shock absorption, you're going to hit the ground. Your harness and lanyard's doing you no good, so you need to go with a different type of equipment there, or maybe a different type of fall protection system altogether. You want to make sure that your fall distance is going to be greater than your total lanyard harness tie-off distance is going to be. Methods of use for the lanyard system as well too, and inspection, storage of the system, all must be covered in the training. Who needs to be trained in this? Any employee assigned to work near unguarded leading edges over 4 feet. When? They must be trained upon initial assignment, and then upon manufacturer's recommendations is how to refresh that training. There are different manufacturers of different pieces of equipment out there. Might be a harness lanyard system, might be some other type of tie-off connection, could be an overhead lifeline system. It depends on the manufacturer's recommendations about how often to complete that training. Respiratory protection. This one here is applicable if the employee is required or voluntarily, and I should have underlined that word, voluntarily wears a respirator. So if you have a painting operation or some kind of chemical operation and the employee is, based off of your research, your air testing out there, the employee is required to wear respirators, you probably already know that you got to train them on that respirator. But if you're out there walking in the plant or on the shop floor and you see an employee wearing a respirator and they're like, oh, they just wear that just to keep the dust out, or they wear it because you know, they're a little bit, I don't know, maybe they're germaphobes or whatever it might be, or maybe they just want to feel more protected. That's fine. The employee can do that. But the employer is still responsible for making sure that employee is trained how to wear that respirator the proper way. So maybe you don't even want a respiratory protection program, but an employee wants to feel safe and wear a respirator, you got to train them then. You got to protect the employee from themselves and make sure they're knowledgeable in that respirator. So it covers the following. The written program, if you have one on site, what kind of respiratory hazards are going to be around the facility, how to select the right type of respirator, medical evaluations, completing an annual fit test, and then taking care and maintaining the respirator as well too. Who needs to complete it? Like I said, any employees required or voluntarily wear a respirator. When does it need to be completed? The actual training needs to happen before donning the respirator, and then it needs to happen on an annual basis afterwards as well too. And don't forget that a fit test needs to happen on an annual basis if the employee is required to wear the respirator. Confined space. Get lots of questions about this one as well too. It's applicable if the employees will be entering an identified confined space. And really we're getting into, well, which type of confined space? Well, we've got confined spaces, limited or restricted means for entry or exit and not designed for continuous occupancy. Then you have permit required confined space. So we take the definition above and then we add to it, does that space have a hazardous atmosphere, engulfment hazard, or any other serious hazard? Then it's a permit required confined space. Now we need to have specialized training for that particular permit required confined space. Not a generalized training overall, but for that particular space, your employees must be trained on the hazards with that space. So what is it going to cover? It's going to be duty specific, because the employees that are going to be entering that confined space need to be on a team. And so you have attendants, you have entry personnel, you have entry supervisors as well. So the training is going to be duty specific. Your attendees have specific duties they must be trained on, such as how to do rescue, who to call, you know, being on a fire watch. You have entry personnel. You need to train them on the hazards, what kind of equipment they need to take in with them, what kind of, you know, can they produce a spark while in that confined space, or is that absolutely not allowed? And then you have your entry supervisors who need to be coordinating all this. So who needs to be trained in the permit required confined space? Well, the employees who are going to be assigned to the duties for that specific permit required confined space. When do they need to be trained? Well, upon the duty assignment. Any changes in the assigned duties make you maybe a attendant needs to become an entry person and vice versa at some point. Well, they need to be retrained up. Any changes in the hazards in that confined space, and if the employer has reason to believe that deviations have been made from the permit requirements, now we need to make sure that we retrain everybody once again, so there's no deficiencies. Once again, it's that whole deficiencies item. Then there's some other type of specific hazards that are out there as well too. So what I just went over, a lot of different site-specific items, but now we're starting to drill more and more deeper into training. And here's where it comes down to, you got to assess your own specific facility, and maybe there's additional trainings that could be out there for your employees to take as well too, such as maybe you're a chemical manufacturer, or maybe you have tons of chemicals on site, maybe 10 tons of a certain chemical, or 10,000 pounds. At this point, we're talking maybe you need to have process safety management where you have specific training for everybody that's a part of that process. Or there could be a specialized equipment training. You know, there could be specific operator training requirements for maybe some of the larger power presses, shearing machines, automotive lifts if you're in a car dealership. Those have special ANSI, American National Standard Institute, requires that employees be trained over those, how to operate a lift. Well, OSHA has adopted that ANSI standard under general duty clause. I guess I shouldn't use that. They haven't really adopted it, but if an OSHA officer is on site and they see somebody and they've dropped a car off of a lift and they're responding to that, one of the questions is going to be asked, has this employee been trained on how to operate this piece of machinery? If your answer is no, then you don't really have much of a leg to stand on. Same thing with power presses, shearing machines. If there's an accident that happens on site and it triggers an OSHA inspection, one of the questions is going to be, was this employee trained on how to operate this piece of equipment? Show me documentation. If you got nothing, you don't really have any grounds to stand on and probably going to end up in some kind of citation. Let's switch gears and go into environmental training. So this has to deal with the EPA, and so what EPA requirements am I required to train my employees on? Well, if you are a hazardous waste generator, then there's a possibility that your employees need to take hazardous waste training. Hazardous waste is going to be waste that you get rid of from the facility that could be ignitable, it could be toxic, could be corrosive, and it can't be thrown away as a normal waste. It must be treated and taken away by a special hauler. Then you possibly have hazardous waste. There are different generator statuses. If you're a small quantity generator or a large quantity generator, and you can see there on the screen, small quantity generator, you generate between 220 and 2,200 pounds in a month. A large quantity generator, you generate more than 2,200 pounds in a month. If you're either one of those, the employees who handle the hazardous waste must be trained in hazardous waste. There's another classification out there, and that's conditionally exempt small quantity generator, and they are exempt from training, but once again, it's still highly recommended to train the handlers because they will be handling that hazardous waste. They want to make sure that they do package it right, they do put the right labels on there, they are grounding the right containers. So highly recommended that they do the hazardous waste training, but it is only required if you are a small or large quantity generator. It covers the following topics: proper waste handling procedures and emergency procedures in case anything were to go wrong. Once again, who needs to take this training? Any kind of emergency coordinators for hazardous waste and employees who handle hazardous waste, specifically small quantity generators and large quantity generators. When must they complete this? Upon initial assignment of handling hazardous waste. Right now, there's nothing I can find in regulations about refreshers. As I always do, I recommend an annual refresher over any of these. NESHAP 6H spray coatings is another, and there are a lot of different NESHAP regulations that are out there. Some of them apply to gas stations and gasoline. Some of them apply to furniture coating entities. I'm talking about 6H because it specifically goes into spray coatings for paint. A lot of our facilities have some kind of painting operation. So it's applicable if employees spray coatings which are subject to the rule. Generally, you know, if you are in a collision center, you are probably going to be subjected to the rule. If you have more than one booth, if you do more than 3 cars in a year, we're talking you are subjected to the rule. And even if you have one booth, there's great chance you're subjected to the rule. If your volume amount is more than 3 ounces at a time, then you are subjected to the rule as well too. There are some exemptions. If you want to go know more about the regulation, if you've never heard of it in the past, reach out to KPA and we'll make sure, based off of what your specific site procedures are, whether or not you need to comply with 6H. What does it cover? The NESHAP regulations, spray techniques to make sure to minimize overspray so it doesn't get in the environment, and then general housekeeping. Who needs to complete this? Any employee who will be spraying coatings and subjected to NESHAP. When do they need to complete it? Within 180 days upon initial assignment, and then a refresher every 5 years. So those are EPA requirements. So it doesn't have to be upon initial assignment, but within that first 180 days, they need to be trained in that, and then every 5 years afterwards. Spill prevention, control, and countermeasures plan. This is only applicable if you have the need for a SPCC plan, which that's how they'll refer to it. So if your facility has a capacity to store over 1,320 gallons of petroleum-based product on site, you must have one of these plans. You also must train your employees over the plan, what's written in the plan, how to respond to a spill. So what are you covering in the training? The written plan, housekeeping, emergency cleanup procedures, and then inspections of tanks as well. Who is this training for? Any employees designated in the plan to have any type of specific roles need to be trained in those roles. And then when the plan is signed into effect, and then EPA does recommend an annual refresher. However, they have no requirements, but they do recommend an annual refresher. Refrigerant recovery and recycling. Once again, this is kind of site specific. If you have any type of refrigerant recovery recycling processes, maybe you work in HVAC, maybe you work in a facility where you repair vehicles, and one of the processes could be repairing the air conditioning. So it's applicable if employees will be recovering refrigerants on site. And it covers the following: how refrigerants affect the environment, recovering process and equipment. The main point of this training is that people have an awareness so that they don't release Freon into the environment, because it will basically eat up the ozone layer, causing ozone to drop down to the Earth ground level, which is actually not very good for your overall health. Who needs to complete this? Employees who will be recovering any type of refrigerants or recycling it. And when do they need to be trained? Upon initial assignment. Currently, there is no requirement for refreshers in that course. Stormwater pollution prevention plan. If you have one of these plans, then you need to complete training with your employees over certain aspects of that plan. So it's applicable if the facility has a potential to discharge runoff into a storm water drain. So go out around your facility. Is there a chance that rainwater is going to hit something outside where that runoff, maybe some type of chemical storage outside, maybe it could be you've got drums stacked up outside or anything like that. Is there a chance that rainwater could collect something up and run that into the drain? You know, maybe it's a car wash that's outside. Those car wash chemicals, they're going directly into the storm drain. Well, if that's the case, then there's a chance you might need a stormwater pollution prevention plan. So it covers general plan practices, inspections. Who needs to do it? Any employee, once again, designated in the stormwater pollution prevention program to have a specific assignment. They need to be trained upon initial assignment, and once again, EPA recommends an annual refresher over that training. Underground storage tank training. This one's more of a recent type of training. It's applicable if you have an underground storage tank on site. It covers the following. It covers Class A, B, and C operator training. So if you have an underground storage tank, you probably are aware of this already, but you must have at least a Class A, B, C operator employee on site. Doesn't mean you have to have them on site 24 hours a day, but you must have at least an ABC operator. You can have at least one ABC operator, then you can have a couple of B operators, then you can have several C operators, but at least one employee needs to be an ABC operator. And they're getting trained up in the required maintenance and testing of the underground storage tank, financial responsibility, you know, keeping up with the underground storage tank permitting as well too. So who needs to be trained? The employees you designate to be those Class A, B, or C operators. When do they need to be trained? Upon initial assignment as an operator, and it needs to be refreshed at least every 3 years. Hazmat shipping, and on that UST, there are some states that have stepped up and they could require the underground storage tank to be trained every year as well too. Department of Transportation shipping training, hazmat shipping. A lot of people have had to have run-ins with this in the past. So it's applicable if the employees will be shipping hazardous materials, receiving hazardous shipments, or shipping hazardous waste. Because keep in mind on the hazardous waste, maybe you're signing off to a company that's going to haul away your waste for you. But are you reading what you're signing? Because if it's a hazardous waste, it's a hazardous shipment, and you need to be DOT hazmat trained to sign off on it. Because if you actually read what you're signing, you're actually signing off that you, for the most part, have labeled, packaged, complied with all DOT hazmat shipping regulations. And if you're just willy-nilly signing off with your pen that, oh yeah, here you go, your signature, take off with it, I trust you and everything, well, guess who that comes back on in case anything goes wrong with that? Yeah, it probably comes back on the hauler company, but it can come back on whoever signed off on that form because you signed off that that shipment was good to go, packaged, prepared the right way. Covers the following: general awareness, how to package it, how to label it, mark it, shipping paperwork, security awareness as well too. Who needs to be trained? Any employees who take part in any portion of the shipping process. You've got a person that puts just something into a box. That's hazmat. They need to be trained. You've got a person that signs paperwork. They need to be trained. When do they need to be trained? Within 90 days of initial assignment, and then refreshed every 3 years after that. All right, so that was a lot of EPA training. We've talked a lot about safety training. Once again, this is not an all-encompassing. It depends on your site and what your employees might need. But you might be asking yourself, man, a lot of those actually did apply to us, and we haven't done any training. How do we go about getting ourselves set up the right way? Well, you can set up your own internal plan, but if you need some help, KPA is a consulting company. We offer on-site consulting that can help with on-site training. We also offer a great learning management system as well too. All these courses that I've talked about, for the most part, not every single one of them, but for the most part, all these courses, we have an online learning management system offering where you can actually upload your employees into our system. They take their training. You can track it. It's called My KPA Online is the website. And they're actually really good modules. They get the point across. They're entertaining. They do also have quizzes at the end of them to make sure that the employees are keeping up with not just simply clicking through, but actually retaining the information as well. So it's a great system to track to make sure that all of your employees are getting their proper training completed. A couple of tips as well too. Maybe you're looking at it as, where do I begin? Once again, well, start with the big three: emergency response, hazard communication, personal protective equipment. Get those knocked out for the employees. Get those done. Also, evaluate the applicability of the other training topics as well too. Do you need to train your employees over those? Develop a tracking system so that nobody slips through the cracks and everybody does get trained. And then make training routine as well too. So first great step in doing that is incorporate it into a new hire orientation system. Maybe you don't already have a new hire orientation. This is a great way to start one. And then offer it more than annually. So maybe you've got people that would like to come in and sit down in the new hire orientation to do their refreshers. Maybe you've got a new hire orientation that happens every 2 months, every month, every quarter. Well, then they've got a chance to come in there and refresh their training more often than just annually. So those are some tips that can help you out. Once again, reminder, these topics that I covered were from the OSHA Standards for General Industry, 29 CFR 1910. Construction is 29 CFR 1926. They might have some different variations as far as requirements for training. When you get into rigging and shoring and things like that, there are other types of trainings that might be required that are out there. Also, there could be more trainings that are required due to local and state regulations as well too. And once again, if you do want some more information, or maybe you want an evaluation of your site, reach out to KPA and the consultant can contact you and help out. At this point, that's pretty much all I've got for the presentation. I'm going to go back to Allison and see if there are any questions that might have come up during the presentation. So Allison?
Okay, great. Thanks, Zach, for presenting on how to maximize the effectiveness of EHS training. So those are some really good reminders. We do have a couple questions today, but just wanted to remind everybody that all the telephone lines are muted. So if you could use the question feature in the corner of your screen, that would be great. The first question is kind of a general question. What about general BBP training? Was one of the questions. I don't know if you could do a review on that, Zach.
Yeah, I could do a review on that one. Bloodborne pathogens training, and I did cover that on one of the slides when it comes to general bloodborne pathogens training. Once again, you have to assess in your facility, do you have a reasonable exposure to be working around blood on a day-to-day basis? If the answer to that question is no, which I would have a feeling for most of the facilities that will be watching this webinar, probably the answer to that question is no. Then bloodborne pathogens program is not a requirement, and therefore it's optional to do that training. It is now, if you want to do a bodily fluids or a bloodborne pathogens generalized training just to make employees aware, that's fine. But don't go as far as having a whole standard and program, because you might have some gaps in your program that could open you up for liability, such as, wait, let's go ahead and put it in a bloodborne pathogens program, and we'll write everything up, we'll train everybody. Well, did you offer the hepatitis B vaccine? And if you didn't, that's a gap in your whole program. And you just admitted that you have a program on the site by putting one together. So it might not be the best thing to do that and stick with the, well, we're just, there's no reasonable expectation that employees are going to be working around blood. We'll leave that for EMS services. And basically, if there is bodily fluids, just people stay away from it until we do get a cleanup. Once again, if you want to just do a generalized course over bloodborne pathogens, just to kind of remind employees, hey, there's bloodborne pathogens that are out there. Put on, if you do happen to come across it and you are going to clean it up, put on gloves. You know, that's perfectly fine to do, but not a requirement to do one, unless you have a facility where you are going to be exposed to blood or bodily fluids every day. Then it's a requirement to do that. Hopefully that kind of answered that portion of it.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. And then just want to remind everybody, we did have a couple questions come in asking if the recording and the presentation slides will be available after, and we will be sending those out today, so you should get those in your inbox here shortly. And then just moving on to the next question, it's about confined space. So in the confined space, is in the confined space considered inside a tanker truck?
Yes, that's going to be a confined space. Now, is it a permit required confined space? Meaning, is there going to be a hazard inside of that tanker truck? In my past experience, there have been issues where maybe it was a confined space where it was a tanker truck that contained some kind of ammonia or formaldehyde or something like that. Then we've got hazardous working atmospheres in there. Now we're talking it's a permit required confined space. So now, yes, there's going to need to be basically a permit on hand. The duties, responsible officers as well too. Supervisor duties are going to need to be entrant duties, and then attendant watches duties as well too, to make sure that everybody working inside of that tanker truck is going to be okay in that hazardous atmosphere. And if something goes wrong, that attendant can go into rescue methods as well too. So it depends on what was inside the tanker truck. If it's a clean truck on the inside, then it's just a confined space, and we don't need the whole permit going along with it. And just employees need to be aware that it's a confined space. But if it is a hazardous atmosphere inside of there, now we're talking permit required confined space, and that's when we need to go into entrance, supervisors, entrance, and attendants as well too.
Perfect. Thank you. And that looks like those are all the questions for today. Zach, before we end, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, just make sure that take a step back, take a look at your facility, kind of give it a once-over once again. You got a forklift on site or a powered industrial truck? Okay, you know, make a list of all the trainings that you think you need to work on or that need to happen at your facility. And if it seems a little, you know, cumbersome, you know, reach out to KPA and we can really evaluate whether or not something is needed. But start with the list, knock out the big three, and then go into some of the more site specifics from there. And that should get the ball rolling for you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks so much, Zach, for presenting the webinar today. And thank you for everybody for participating. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@kpaonline.com. And everybody have a good day. Thanks so much.